You're listening to Stimulus Tech Talk, a conversation-based podcast created by Stimulus Technologies that covers a range of topics related to business and technology.
Welcome to Stimulus Tech Talk. I'm Sherry Lipp, Marketing Manager at Stimulus Technologies, and I am here with Stimulus Technologies CEO Nathan Whittacre. And today we're going to expand on a topic we brought up in the previous episode on NIST and compliance for businesses, and that is when I asked about, is this optional? So we're going to expand on that concept a little bit deeper because I think this is a point of confusion for some businesses. Welcome, Nathan.
Thanks, Sherry, and welcome everybody to the podcast because we think that compliance is such an exciting topic that we have to cover it multiple weeks.
Yes. Well, it may not be super exciting, but definitely important, and definitely something businesses have questions about. So we will try to make it as interesting as we can. Starting out, so when I asked about optional, we kind of said it is optional, but not totally optional. So why are we feeling like we need to expand on that concept?
I think a lot of business owners feel like, I think just a sense of overwhelm, right? Because there's so many regulations that they have to abide by that are constantly staring them in their face, whether it's, having to deal with payroll regulations, HR regulations, which are big, depending on the state you're in, those are constantly changing and can be very overwhelming. All these regulatory things, taxes, we're in tax season right now, and then suddenly somebody comes along and says, oh, cyber compliance, computer compliance is now an essential part of the way that you do business. And business owners just want to focus on generating revenue, providing good jobs for good people, providing good service for their clients or customers. And it just ends up feeling like it's more paperwork and it just slows things down and it's not a value add to their business. And I think that's why a lot of business owners either put it off or just don't want to do it at all because it just doesn't seem to add value to their businesses.
And when I say optional, obviously protecting client data and personal data is not optional. There's a lot of regulations around that, but we were talking about things like MFA, and there's not. Am I correct in thinking there's not like a set standard, like this is what businesses have to do when it comes to some of these other things?
It depends. If you're in a non-regulated industry, you may not have to do it. But if you are in a regulated industry that requires things like MFA or having EDR protection, MDR, SIEM, some of the things that we brought up in the podcast in the past from a cybersecurity standpoint, those things are now becoming required part of the contract of doing business with your customers. So one clear example is in the defense industry. If you want to do business with the Department of Defense, now you have to follow CMMC regulation, which requires those type of things. And then, we've talked about a number of times in the podcast, if you want to do business with regulated industries, and you may not be directly regulated, but you're doing business with a regulated industry, you may also have to do those things, so they may require you to. So, that feeling of I I have this, great product or great service I'd like to sell to this customer, but then they ask me for my SOC 2 type 2 report and I'm not SOC 2 compliant. Or, I have to have certain cyber liability insurance and the most I can get is $50,000 and this customer is requiring $1 million policy or something like that. So what's happening now is if you want to do business either in certain industries or do business with certain types of customers, you have to become compliant to a lot of these things. And that's when it becomes not optional anymore. Now, if you don't want to do business in those industries or you don't want to, follow the compliance frameworks, I use the example of, driving down the freeway at 100 miles an hour. It might be fine until it isn't. Until you get in a serious accident and kill yourself, or you get pulled over by the cops and have a large fine. And I think that example is applicable here because if you're going along and you're saying that you're compliant, that you're following, these frameworks or these, rules of compliance, and then somebody comes along and finds out that you weren't, and you want to do, file against your cyber liability insurance, or they do an audit as part of a contract, and you're not following those regulations, it can lead to large fines. Or worse yet, the kill yourself part of that analogy is you're not doing those things and you have a major breach, or ransomware attack or something along those lines that could certainly put you out of business, which is death to your company. So it might be fine until someday it's not.
And do you find that there are businesses, lots of business owners or businesses that are unaware or confused by like what they're supposed to do?
Yeah, I think in some industries it certainly is. An example that we run across a lot is dental practices often think that because they're not a doctor's office, a medical office in their minds, that the HIPAA compliance isn't required for them. But, HIPAA follows all patient records, including dental offices. So that's a great example that of a small practitioner that thinks that they don't have to follow the regulations. Other things that might not be as strict is, again, if you're working in an unregulated industry, but doing work for clients that are in a regulated industry, that might fall because you're trying to sell to somebody in that industry. It might also fall on you. Like, for example, in the state of Nevada, one interesting thing about the gaming industry is that there are certain vendors, to whether it's directly to the casino or to a vendor of a casino. If you're supplying services to either the casino or one of their vendors, you may need to have a gaming license. And you might want to do business with them, and you might be doing business with them. If the gaming control board comes and does an audit and finds that you don't have the proper licensing, there could be large fines, and or not be able to do business anymore without that type of license. So I think a lot of businesses, may not be aware, or they might be aware but think that they're either too small, or there's enough separation between them and the regulated business that they don't have to comply by the regulations. So it's something that you don't want to find out post fact and lose the business out because you aren't following those regulations.
Do you find that some people kind of know they need to do something, but they've been putting it off?
Yeah, we've run into that with prospects. When we talk about these things, they say, "Well, I'm aware, but we're either too small or don't need to do it. Haven't been caught yet." And it gets the same thing as driving down the freeway super fast, and you might not have gotten a ticket for years until you get pulled over and get a large ticket. So that's what I worry about with people that think that they're not going to get caught, because they might eventually, and it could be a lot worse.
If somebody's in a business that's not regulated and not working with a regulated or the Department of Defense, could it still affect their cyber insurance or cyber liability insurance if they're not following certain things?
Yeah, that's the big thing that's happening right now, is that to get cyber liability insurance is becoming much stricter. It's been one of the biggest loss areas for insurance companies, and so they might offer you a very small policy without significant audit of what's going on. But if you want something like a $250,000 or more policy, which I think a quarter million is kind of the minimum now, because the loss of revenue, the loss of potential lawsuits can be significantly bigger than that. So if you don't have at least $250,000 or more, I don't think it's even worth having the cyber insurance, because it's not going to cover the losses. So now what they're doing is they aren't just asking you to provide an attestation, they're actually doing audits to ensure that you are following what you're saying you're doing. So you have to have some basics in place, like multi-factor authentication, endpoint protection, disaster response plans, security policies, acceptable use policies, things like that in place. They're going to ask you for copies of those. And now what's happening is they're going to ask you for evidence that you're complying. So they may have a third-party firm come in and do an audit. They may do penetration testing on your network, and if you're showing significant vulnerabilities, they could either increase your premiums dramatically or they can deny you coverage. And then worse still is if you have a claim after an incident and you weren't following what you filled out on your attestation, they could deny the claim and also sue you for insurance fraud. So it is, and there's plenty of cases out there that this has happened, that these insurance carriers are coming back to recoup costs because it is such a large area loss for these insurance companies now. So certainly don't try to get cyber insurance and lie on your applications, making sure that you're doing all the right things and filling out appropriately on the applications as you go through it.
Do you know what happens if, let's say, somebody is trying to do all the right things, but there's an individual employee who turns out they weren't following unique password rules or MFA or something like that?
They're probably a little bit less strict on that if it's a, single employee and not ubiquitous across the entire company. So where companies get in trouble is, they say they have, MFA in place and they have none. If it was missed on one account or one site, they might be a little bit more lenient on that, or one employee not doing it right. But they want you to show that you're making every reasonable attempt to enforce the policies that you have in place. So there's, definitely a comparison against reasonableness. And, there could be a case in some instances if you're, working in, go back to the defense contractor, if you are working in a high security environment, things that you'll have to prove 100% compliance on these things. But in most industries, I think as a best effort to have compliance is more important than no compliance at all. So should be doing everything you can as a company. There's never 100%, but you should do everything you can to make sure that you're complying with the regulations and complying with what you said you were going to do.
And so from a customer perspective or a client of a business perspective, what should people be looking for from businesses to make sure that their information is protected?
Yeah, that's actually a good question. So, if you are a customer of a company, business to business customer, some things you can ask for is their SOC 2 report. That'll give you documentation on what they're doing. If they aren't SOC 2 compliant, you can, ask them for their compliance paperwork of, what type of cyber insurance do they have, what their policies are. And if they can't produce any of that, then you can recommend a consultation with Stimulus Technologies that we can come in and assist them to get all that documentation put together. So, this is something that we're encouraging our clients to do is not just look internally, but look at the people that they're doing business with to ensure that they're keeping their data safe. Because a lot of the, especially the financial fraud, is coming from a vendor reaching out and saying, please update my ACH information for payments. It needs to go to this bank account now, and then you pay for services, and then it's going to a hacker's account because that account's receivable person's email was compromised. That's a very common type of attack that's going on. So there's that vendor customer relationship, whether you are supplying services or you're receiving services from another company. We're recommending to go up and down the relationship stream between your vendors and customers to ensure that there's compliance, especially protecting against financial fraud. And that's where there's could be a lot of issues. Could lose a lot of money, that you have to file a claim if you send out a wire, an ACH to a company, and it went to a hacker's bank account. Now there's ACH financial fraud, and you'd have to go against one of your insurance policies to recoup that money, or your vendor or customer could have to do the same thing.
And is auditing vendors something that we can help our clients do?
Yeah, that's part of our one of our programs when you're on our higher level plans. That's one thing that we help with is gathering those documentations and ensuring that's documented on their, your vendors' policies. And if they don't have the appropriate policies in place or the safeguards in place, that we can, work with that vendor on getting getting to that point, and certainly would like them as a customer to help them get fully assessed and get up to speed on some of these cyber liability issues.
And if we find that a vendor is not up to the standards and maybe they're not gonna they're not gonna do anything, do we recommend that they change? Is that hard to do?
It could be the recommendation if they're, you know, I mean, obviously, if it's, if you're going to Home Depot and buying parts from them, probably not as big a deal, if paying by credit card on a point of sale system. But if they're a critical vendor of yours and, if they are supplying a service or a product that is essential to your operations and they get compromised and suddenly you can't get that service or product from them, that's something that you should consider renegotiating or finding a new vendor if they're unwilling to comply with the same level of regulations that you are, because it certainly puts you at risk of your be able to ability to do operations if they are have a cyber event, cyber attack, and they're down for weeks at a time. So I think that's a really interesting question. So if there's alternate providers, that certainly could be a reason to, you know, move to a different provider that does have that type of, system in place.
And when we're talking to a potential client, we talk about our network assessment where we're assessing their technology and where they're at. Is this part of that assessment? Is this something separate, or does it depend?
Yeah, it starts with that. So we do, a combination of a verbal assessment to see where they're at, policies, procedures, things like that. And a lot of questions we ask, it might be, well, I think we have it, but we don't know. And then, it's gathering all that to put together. Then we do an internal and external assessment of their network. But it's a little bit more than that. Now diving into it is analyzing, okay, where those gaps are, how are you doing things like you mentioned the password policies across the network. It could be implementing a new password manager that everybody has access to. So there's often a lot of work that comes with it, and just talking to the employees and working through business operations, because it's not just about technology, it's about how businesses operate to improve their level of security and sophistication in their operations.
And what are the biggest gaps that you've seen and that you see regularly when we're doing this?
So we see passwords is a big one. People were using passwords all over the place. We see lack of enforcement of multi-factor authentication. We see a lot of what we call shadow IT. So people having administrative accounts locally on their own machines or to their cloud services. So, a business owner or office manager is using an administrator account for their logins to Microsoft 365. So if that user got compromised, it would take out their entire system. Those are some of the immediate gaps that we find quickly that most businesses have. And then we start digging down into it a little bit more as, there might be a lack of disaster recovery plans. Maybe backups are happening, but they aren't really tested. There's no documentation on policies. Potentially, like patching isn't working 100% on all the computers. We find employees that still have access to the network or accounts that shouldn't have access. So, lack of communication between HR and IT. So those are some of the big gaps. And it's usually not just one big issue, it's a lot of little gaps that add up to a big problem on company networks.
And to kind of wrap things up, what is the if somebody's worried about gaps, what is the first thing you would tell somebody to look for before they call us, of course?
Our phone number, look for our phone number or email address. No, I think, maybe ask around. I would say start with your cyber liability insurance attestation and go down that, and then ask your who is in charge of it, whether it's your controller or CFO, or if you ask your IT vendor to help fill that out, and just go line by line and say, okay, can you show me that we're complying with multi-factor authentication? Can you show me that we have removed administrative accounts? Can you show me that we have endpoint protection on every device? Just ask for proof and evidence of compliance with that cyber liability attestation. And then that will show you whether or not generally you're following best practices, because most of those applications now, if you're following them completely, you will be following best practices. And so that's where I would start, is go through that. And then if you want a third-party assessment, again, I'll pitch Stimulus's assessment. We will come in and give you an idea of where you're at. It's not a 100-page report. It's a few pages. We'll show you the biggest things where you can have the biggest gains, improving your cyber practices and compliance to whatever standards you need to be compliant with.
All right. Well, and if people would like to learn more, I will put the link to our consult you can schedule with us down below in the description. And please leave us a comment or like this if you're watching it on YouTube. But thanks, Nathan.
Thanks, Sherry, and thanks for everybody joining us.